Well, you might remember a little bit about the context here of Romans chapter 13. We looked at this last time. It's in the context of governing authorities and how we respond to government. What we saw to this point is that how we submit is an act of worship because God instituted government, and we submit, therefore, as an act of submission to Him. And so, in essence, being a good citizen is an act of worship. And so what do? We pray for our leaders. We obey the laws of the land. We honor those who honor is to be given. We pay taxes. Now, the question that we haven't really dealt with to this point is, what do you do about bad government? And I can promise you that was on the minds of all of these people who were reading these words from Paul because they knew exactly what bad government looks like. If you think we know what bad government looks like, you should have lived in the first century when the Apostle Paul was writing these words. I mean, there are questions that we want to ask ourselves. What do we do about bad government? What if government is actually in opposition to God? And we're not the first people to ask those kind of questions. I mean, throughout the Bible, those questions were asked by people who loved God. Think about some of the prophets. Think about Daniel, who was taken away in exile in Babylon, who had to ask the question, what are we going to do? Babylon and Daniel and the three Hebrew children, they purpose in their hearts that they wouldn't defile themselves. How are we going to live in a culture that's constantly seeking to defile us and defile one another? Think about Ezekiel and the Hebrew exiles. All the prophets had to ask this question on a regular basis. What do we do? Because sometimes even the prophets were in the middle of bad government that was called Israel, Judah. These governments, these kings that were supposedly men of God, men who had been ordained by God to lead their land, the prophets realized that they were in opposition to God. So this question's not a new question. What do you do about bad government? And certainly the Christians in Rome had questions about what do you do in regard to the emperor. I mean, Paul wrote this letter to encourage these Christians about what it looks like to live in the middle of this corrupt world, this morally bankrupt government where the emperor claimed to be a god and where Christians were persecuted for believing that Jehovah, God himself, was the one God and the only one to be worshiped, the true God and maker of heaven and earth. So if you have questions about our government, they are legitimate, but you're not alone. That's been asked for really as long as government has existed. Now, we know that the day may come when we here in the United States as Christians may have to take stands against a government that would bring literal persecution. And so don't you just sort of imagine that when Paul began to write these things, these Christians sort of were like on the edge of their seats hoping that he would give them some answers for what to do. We've been enjoying here in America this unprecedented season of peace. But even today, don't you know that Christians today are, if you read the newspaper and if you pay attention to where our world is going, we can see that things are going to be more difficult for us and for our kids and for our grandchildren. And by the way, we are isolated here in America in a lot of ways because these questions are already being asked of other Christians in other places around the world like Russia and Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and North Korea. It's a life and death matter for Christians around the world to learn how to respond properly to bad government. So we need to be preparing ourselves for our answer. We need to know that this is a question that's been asked, and the good news is Romans gives us some direction. And the verses that we just read are the beginning of the answer to that. And I certainly hope you were paying attention because the beginning of the answer to how you deal with bad government can be summed up in just one four-letter word, correct? And by the way, it's not spelled V-O-T-E. Did you see the text? I'm afraid that a lot of times we don't spell properly the word that's most needed in our world. I'm afraid that a lot of Christians in circles and the Christian communities have forgotten that we have a higher obligation than just simply trying to participate in the political process in order to affect change. And by the way, I do believe we should participate in the political process. And yes, if you follow the reasoning of the previous verses, our participation in the political process is actually a form of worship, right? Because when we submit, when we participate, then we can be doing this in submission to God. It's frankly why I tell obedient Christians that they ought to vote according to biblical principles, to the best of their ability, to not be confused by the feelings or personal preferences, but to actually understand that what righteousness looks like and try to uphold righteousness as much as we can. We should vote as best as we can for those who will prayerfully and hopefully uphold righteousness. And it's often not a black and white issue. You know that, right? You get that, right? So, there may be other things that we have to say in future dates about government, but let me go back to that little 4-letter word again. You know what the word is, right? Spell it out with me, right? O-V-E, love. Good, you were paying attention. I told you earlier that we'll probably conclude Romans in this calendar year, but that we'll really never get done with Romans. If we don't ever get done with Romans, I hope it's because of these verses right here. Because this may be the core of the message that he really wanted to get to tell us that we are to owe no one anything except to love one another. Do you remember what Jesus said about the greatest commandment when he's asked, what is the most important thing we can be doing? What is it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love people. On the night before Jesus was crucified, he was talking to his disciples, and he told them this. He said, listen, I'm going to give you a new commandment. This new commandment is that you love one another just as I have loved you. That's how you should love one another. So, this is obviously pretty important to Jesus. It's obviously very important to the heart of God, and it's very important to the message of Romans. All this stuff that we have been looking at, all of it, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. It's in the gospel that the righteousness of God is revealed by faith, for faith, so that we can live by faith for the rest of our lives, because that's what the just people do. So all of that has been leading us to this place right here in Romans chapter 13. And right here in Romans chapter 13, Paul writes that loving others is a debt that we owe. Now, I have questions based on the verses that we see here. I have questions about how these verses relate to government, because this is in the context of government. But I think there's even more fundamental questions we have to deal with before we start talking about how do we apply this to government. I think we need to ask the basic questions before we get back to how we respond to bad government. In fact, after all is said and done, the summation of this letter could be found right here, and so we need to deal with these before we can formulate a Christian response to anything else. And I have questions. I have questions about how we should live in a world like we find ourselves. But the bigger questions sound more like this. How is love a debt in the first place? And how is this a gospel imperative? Because this entire letter is about the gospel, about the good news. And so how is this an imperative that comes out of the gospel? And another question I think is really important for us to deal with, and sometimes we talk about it, we touch on it, but I think we need to struggle with this one, and that is, what does it mean to love others like we love ourselves? And so let's tackle those in order today and talk a little bit about that. And that'll give us a foundation for coming and talking about the things that some of you have been holding your breath about and some of you have been salivating over. Let's talk about government. No, let's talk about what's most important. Let's talk about love. How is love a debt? Look at verse 8. Owe no one anything except to love one another. And if you look at the previous verses, you're going to see, here's the context. Pay to all what is owed them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. And so Paul almost feels like he shifts gears a little bit, but he's still in this context. And so in the context of the debts and the obligations that we find ourselves having in life, he says that we should owe nothing except to love. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is Paul putting our love for others in the same kind of category as these very common kinds of obligations that we might have? I mean, I owe taxes, and so I'm in debt to my taxes until I pay my taxes. I owe a mortgage and I'm in debt to that mortgage until I pay off that debt. A friend loans me his car. I'm obligated to return it. And by the way, I would say return it in at least as good a condition as I received it, and maybe with more gas than I got it. And what? And wash. Yeah, a wash job, man. Especially when I borrow Lou Halter's truck. Where are you, Lou? He keeps it really clean. Someone's shown me a great kindness, and that puts me in an obligation to them. So since obviously verse 8 follows verse 7, it might mean when it says that we're not to owe anyone except to love, it might mean that we have an obligation that comes out of the behavior and the attitudes of others. If that's the case, then these verses are exceedingly difficult, aren't they? I mean, for one thing, think about the Roman government. It wasn't worthy of respect and honor. They certainly weren't worthy of love. Rome would kill Christians because they were Christians, no matter how hard the Christians tried to be good citizens. And by the way, they were among the best of citizens. But Rome saw Christianity as a threat, and so they persecuted Christians because of it. And so this is something different, isn't it? How is love a debt? I mean, some debts are debts that you can pay off. I mean, you can make your final car payment. Isn't that awesome to make that last payment and you're no longer in debt? You own the car. But Paul argues that you can never pay this debt off. This is something you can never pay off. I mean, we owe just as much after making a payment as we did before. And some of you feel that with your mortgage. I get that. But love will never come to an end. And so the spirit behind verse 8 goes much, much deeper than just the previous verses. And that's the reason why Paul creates a contrast here. He's not saying that we are supposed to merely love people, but that every action we take as Christians should be covered in love. And so in the immediate context, we pay taxes in love. Now notice, I didn't say we love to pay taxes. Those are two totally different things, okay? You get that? All right? But when we pay our taxes, we should be doing that in love. That essentially means that love is somehow applicable to every category of life. It means that how you perform your task as an employee is an opportunity for you to show love. How you manage your money. How you interact with your neighbors. How you respond to that police officer who pulls in behind you and has words for you. How you react to other drivers in Banner Elk when the traffic's backed up from the stoplight all the way up to Lowe's Hardware. Let everything be done in love. Now, it still doesn't really answer the question, how is love a debt? Because when did my love for you become a debt? And what about the even harder thing, to love my enemies? When we tend to think of debts, we tend to think of things that need to be repaid, and yet he's not asking us to repay to people something that they've expressed to us, certainly not government. And so since we've been away from Romans for a little while, we took a break during our whole Christmas season, let's remind ourselves about some of the foundational truths that we've been looking at in Romans that may help us. When we go all the way back to the beginning, you'll remember in Romans chapter 1, Paul actually started this whole letter off by talking about his obligation. He said that he is under an obligation in verse 14 of chapter 1. I'm under an obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish, he wrote. And so here in Romans 13, verse 8, that this doesn't come in a vacuum. This whole letter has been expressed to us in this, underneath this umbrella of chapter 1, where I'm not ashamed of the gospel. All these things are going on, and he says, I'm under this obligation. I have an obligation to people. And although he doesn't use the word love in that first opening paragraph of chapter 1, he does give us this idea of debt, and the idea here is a continuation of that. How did I get in debt? Paul would say, well, the gospel did this for me. The gospel is what made me a debtor, because it's the gospel that's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. And so if you think about how he opened this letter, he sort of gave us that preview. A good writer always does that. They'll give you a preview of all that they're going to be talking about. And so he gave us this preview. Let's draw on these things that we've learned in Romans throughout this letter about what the gospel is. How did we earn it? We didn't, right? How do we keep it? We don't. Did we deserve it? We didn't. And so when we think about love, we don't typically put that in the category of an obligation, do we? In fact, thinking of love as an obligation almost contradicts the very nature of love. I mean, how many of you gave a gift to somebody this Christmas because you knew they would give you a gift? Oh, well, I better get a gift for her because she's going to get a gift for me, right? Isn't that awful? Sometimes we forget why we give gifts. Here's the overwhelming point of Scriptures. Love is free. It's free. And if I'm only doing something for you because you did something for me, Jesus actually called people out on that. He said, hey, listen, even the tax collectors and the sinners can do those kinds of things. So, what makes me a debtor to love you if you've given me nothing? What makes me a debtor to love a person who I may never meet? And what makes me a debtor to love someone who maybe is my enemy? You see, this is the core of the gospel message, because that's exactly what God did for all of us. We received the blessings of God freely. And that makes my debt of love a natural response to God's gift. I'm a debtor, Paul wrote in chapter 1, to everyone else, because in verse 5 he said, I received grace through Jesus Christ. Why am I a debtor? Because God has loved me big. And so, when he says that he's a debtor, it's not because people did something for him, it's because God did something for him. And this is huge. This is the heart of the gospel. This is what changes our lives when we understand that the debt of love that we have to love everyone is not because they've done anything for us, but it's because Christ has done everything for us when we didn't deserve it. Because get this, one of the things we just have to recognize, the world doesn't deserve our love, just from that obligation standpoint. And if you miss this point, then life is just not going to make any sense. Some of you have been hurt in such terrible ways that it'd be wrong for me to stand up here and just say, get over it. You're a Christian, get over it. You just need to love those people. Some of you have been hurt so deeply that that's not a natural response. It is not a human response. And apart from the context of Romans chapter 13, that kind of talk would be really unfair and hurtful. And I think that's the danger sometimes in this vehicle that we call preaching, is that sometimes preachers get up here and say absolute statements that in the context of your life hurt and they're difficult. And so we have to understand that these words, they come out of the text to us in the context of all that Paul's had to say about God's glorious grace freely given to us. I am a wretched dead man, Paul called himself. And even after my salvation, I struggle mightily with this body of sin. Paul's point throughout the entire letter has been simply this, that nobody deserves the love of Christ. Nobody. And so despite my rebellion against God, Christ took away all my sin. Hallelujah. He freely gave his life for me. He knew everything about me, all the things that I have done, all the things that I will do. And he took away the guilt. He took away the condemnation. He personally guarantees my future glory and standing with God and everlasting joy. And all of that happened in Romans chapter 5 while I was still his enemy. Do you get that? Do you understand how important the gospel is? And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why we're in debt to love others. Not because people are worthy of love, but because God deems people to be worthy of love. If you're not loving people, you've totally missed the point of God's love for you. John Piper explains it this way. He says, you might think, no, this doesn't make us want to love people. This makes us a debtor to God to love him. He says, but this is what makes love really love. And this is what makes his love really free and our love for each other really free. Christ cannot and dare not be paid back by us. Do you get this? Hear this. He cannot be paid back because our debt's infinite. We owed a debt we could not pay, so we cannot pay him back. We can never afford to pay him back. And he cannot be paid back because all of our acts of so-called repayment are enabled by his grace anyway. And so every time we even do anything that's filled with true love and grace, it actually all came from him, so our debt got bigger. I love that. So he says, God gets the glory as the benefactor. We get the complete joy as his beneficiary. And woe to the person who tries to reverse those two roles. Piper goes on to say, he dare not be paid back because we dare not make any attempt to pay him back, because then grace would no longer be grace. If you could pay back grace, it'd be a business transaction. It'd no longer be free. Grace is either free or it's not grace at all. So this is why we have the ability to love others, because God did something for us that we can't even hope to pay him back for. And so when Jesus said, here are the two greatest commandments, love God and love people, this is the reason why we say over and over again here from this pulpit, and we should say this to ourselves and to our families and preach it to one another all the time. There's only one way you can truly love God, and how's that? Love people. Love others. Because so that means our debt to other people is utterly unique. It's the kind of love they don't deserve, but we must pay. It's a kind of debt that's created by something that we receive, but for which we cannot repay to the one who gave it, so we give to others instead. So the pressure to love others doesn't come because of what others do, but from God himself. So the answer to that first question, how is love a debt, is simply this, is that Christ has given us everything when we were no more deserving of love than anyone else, and therefore we can love others because he freely loved us. That's why we are in debt. Love is the natural response of people who've been given a free gift of grace. And it literally begs of us a deeper and more thorough examination of the gospel, and that's the reason why Romans was written. So do you really understand what happened to you in your salvation? Are you mature enough in your faith to where you see your sense of gratitude towards others increasing? Is your sense of obligation toward a lost and dying world increasing? I mean, think about it. Even the hell-bent soul that's deserving of death, rebellious, who spews hatred against God and venom against Christians. That's who you were. That's who I was before Christ. That was me. And so if you miss this point, chapter 13, you got to go back to Romans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You've got to go to all these places. Back in chapter 1, Paul named all kinds of wickedness in the world and what happens to human souls who are in rebellion against God. And then he from the pages of Scripture, Paul pointed his bony finger at us and he said, that's you. That's you. You read things in that list of sinful behavior in chapter 1 that you said, yeah, those people are sinners. And then Paul said, that's you. That's who you are. Because none of us is righteous, not even one. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Stop pointing fingers of accusation at others and look inside to see your own desperate need for salvation. And know that God loves others just like he loved you. And if you miss that, you've missed the gospel. And so we owe them, Paul says in chapter 1, we owe them this message. We owe them this kind of love, he says in chapter 13. So how is love a debt? It's because God put us in debt by his great love for us. But the second question goes something like this. Well, then how is loving others a gospel imperative? And in a sense, we sort of answered that question, didn't we, already? But let's just make this really simple. Look at verse number 9. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now remember that context when the Pharisee came and asked Jesus about what is the greatest commandment. You know, he asked him that question, and the Pharisee was said that it's a great answer. You gave a great answer. That all the commandments, Jesus said, are summed up in this one: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like the first, to love your neighbor as yourself. He says, on these two commandments, Jesus said, hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, listen, as much as I value the Word of God and the Scriptures and the Torah and all Genesis to Malachi, he said, everything that you have ever read in the Old Testament, I can give it to you in 2 sentences. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Wow. Now, look back in these verses again. All the commandments, this is verse number 9, last part, all the commandments, all of them are summed up in this one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Wait a minute, he left something off, didn't he? What did Jesus say? Right? Jesus said, love God, love people. Paul didn't even talk about loving God. He just said, love your neighbor as yourself. Everything is summed up in that. Well, most of you know this. One of my favorite illustrations in this whole conversation that took place when Jesus was asked this question in Luke chapter 10, the Pharisee who asked him was sort of hypocritical and said, well, who's my neighbor, Lord? And so Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. You're very familiar with that. A man was robbed by thieves and left for dead alongside the road, and a couple of religious guys saw him, and they walked by and did their best to avoid him. The Samaritan, who was hated by the culture and hated by the people to whom Jesus told this story, saw the man, had compassion on him, took him, dressed his wounds, took him and made sure he had a place to stay, made sure he was fed, and took care of all of his debt. And at the end of the story, Jesus said, who was the one who showed love to his neighbor? And they all sort of hung their heads in shame and said, well, I guess it was the one who, and Jesus said, okay, well then just go and do that. Just do that. And I think in the essence of that story is that you're doing everything you can to avoid responsibility, to avoid interacting with people around you, and there are needs everywhere around you, and you can't possibly meet all those needs, but God's going to put somebody in your path, and you can meet that person's needs. You can't do for everybody, but you can do for one what you wish you could do for everybody. And so that means that you really can't say that you love God if you're not expressing your love for God in your actions towards others by loving people. And so the gospel teaches us to see other people in the same way that God sees them. That's why this is a gospel imperative. Loving others is a gospel imperative because it has opened the eyes of our heart to see the world like God actually saw us in desperation and need, and how he moved to meet our need. And unlike us, God was able to move to meet the need of all who would come to faith in him. But we can move to meet the needs of anyone who comes into our path, to love them, to show them that God is love. You see, our salvation is based in this knowledge of the fact that we did nothing. We did nothing. Romans 13:9 is telling us to let the love of God spill over into the way that we love others. And so all those other commandments, they give us the details. And so this is the reason why I would say that while Jesus summed up all the law in these 2 commandments, that doesn't mean that the rest of the Old Testament has no value, and that the rest of the law and all that God teaches us in the Bible has no value. All of the other stuff, those are the details. We need the details. We need to know that we're not supposed to lie. We know that we're not supposed to bear false witness. We know we're not supposed to covet. Those kind of things are important to us. But love is the overarching imperative, which means love is a gospel imperative. That if we're really not loving people, then we are not gospel people. And so when we watch the news, and I'm going to tell you, I've been pretty guilty sometimes of watching way too much of the news and getting a little angry. And in my mind, calling down judgment on people that deserve it desperately, right? How about you, huh? Woe to us, right? If you're going to ever use that verse, judge not that you be not judged, use it there. Because that's what the verse means. We're not supposed to call down condemnation on people. That's God's purview. Our responsibility is to love them. Doesn't mean that we don't understand that there are things in this world that are wrong. When Jesus said, judge not that you be not judged, in the same chapter he said that it is obvious that we can determine and see things in people's lives that are wrong. So he didn't try to tell us that, oh, we're just supposed to, turn a blind eye to people's sin. He never said that. But what he did say is that it is not our job to condemn people. We don't have that. That's God's responsibility. So, therefore, how do we love others like we love ourselves? That's the question, isn't it? That's the hard question. That's the question that we have to struggle with. We could spend the space of a lot of Sundays talking about that one because it's such a big thing. I mean, because there's details. Remember, the details can be important here. And I just want to do one thing to clear up a common misconception that people often have about this idea of loving others. I mean, because several years ago, there was a teaching that began to grow in our culture and emerge that said that the reason why people aren't able to love themselves is that they are not able to love others is because they don't love themselves. That's the essential teaching that came in view of psychologists and counselors who believe this. They devoted themselves to help people learn how to love themselves so they can have the resources to love others. And it's a part of our agenda now in our culture. It's part of our parenting agenda. We want to help our kids to know how to love themselves because they can love others. It shows up in the classrooms of our schools. But here's the thing. That conversation always comes in the realm of self-esteem, the self-esteem movement. And so what our culture is saying is to love yourself means that you have a high self-esteem, and if you don't love yourself, it means you have a low self-esteem. But if you interpret our world in that context, or interpret these verses in the light of that context, you're going to miss what Paul's saying here in a couple of ways. Because first of all, the Bible assumes that we already love ourselves. Do you get this? The Bible already makes the assumption that we love ourselves. In fact, it says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. It didn't say, love your neighbor as you wish you loved yourself. It's love your neighbor as you are already loving yourself. So there's no call here for us to love ourselves first because we already do that. That's what the scriptures are saying here. And secondly, the idea here is that because we love ourselves, we are already doing those things that are for our intended happiness. That's what we do. That's what people who love people do. They try to make other people happy. When you love yourself, you try to make yourself happy. Sort of a self kind of love, a self-love that does those things that makes us happy. And now I was reading this concept in another preacher's writing, and I wasn't sure I really agreed with that when I first read that. That you define self-love by doing the things that make yourself happy. But then I thought about what Paul's saying here. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. He is talking about our built-in desire for happiness becoming the measure of our desire for the happiness of others. He used a similar argument in Ephesians chapter 5, didn't he? When he was talking to husbands, love your wives as you love your own bodies, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church. So here's the problem I've got with this whole self-esteem movement as it comes to us now. The assumption is, from the psychologists, is that people with a low self-esteem don't love themselves. But that's not true because everybody without exception loves themselves. Everybody wants food to eat and they'll do almost anything to get it rather than starve. And everybody wants drink and they're going to drink when they're thirsty and do almost anything to get it. Everybody wants to avoid serious injury and death and will do almost anything to avoid them. And if you point to people who are masochists and suicide victims as exceptions because they don't seem to want to avoid these things, they're not really exceptions because the masochist hurts himself because of what it pleasures him. The person who commits suicide is at least trying to minimize the pain that he has. And so you need to separate this idea of esteem from the idea of love. Everybody loves themselves. Do people have low self-esteem? Absolutely yes. Should we help people with low self-esteem? Absolutely yes. But they still love themselves, is what's being said. Everybody likes to be praised, and apart from God's grace, we do things however subtly to be praised. Everybody seeks happiness, however they define it. It may be warped, it may be messed up, it may be a crazy sense of self-love, but it's still the way they love themselves. So, here's the thing. Now get this. I'm not saying that there isn't value in the self-esteem movement. I'm just saying that people love themselves always. We love ourselves, even when it's unhealthy. And so, here's what Paul's saying. The Christian knows who he is, and he still loves himself. So the underlying assumption here is that knowing our total need for grace and that our love for self is rooted in the knowledge of our love for God, Paul doesn't condemn us for loving ourselves. You hear this? Paul never condemns us for loving ourselves. He actually does something way more radical here. He doesn't say stop loving yourself. He just says love others like you love yourself. That's what Jesus said. He didn't say stop your desires for happiness and abandon what you find fulfilling. He simply says to apply the same principle that you would use to find fulfillment in your life and happiness in your life. Use that same kind of energy in how you try to bring happiness and fulfillment to others. Let me give you a personal illustration of this. I've got the new car fever. Any of y'all ever had that before? You want a new car so bad that you're thinking about it all the time? Yep. I can tell you what I want. I've been doing a lot of research. I've been searching the internet. And no matter what else I'm doing, I can tell you I'm not very far from thinking about getting a new car. And some of you even know what I want because I've been talking about it. Why do I want that car? Because I love myself. This is what Debbie has to put up with. So let's just say that the Apostle Paul were here and he invited me to lunch. And sometime during the course of that meal, I'm fairly certain, because of how much I love myself, that I would start talking about that car. Well, now, being a first century kind of guy, the Apostle Paul might have questions, right? Just like we have questions, he might have questions. Like what is a car? And how does it work? But he probably would also ask questions like this: why is the particular car I want the best option for me given my circumstances and the life that I currently have? He might ask that question. At some point, I would tell him about the particular make, model, color, all these things because they please me. And then I think Paul might have more questions. He might even challenge some of my assumptions and motives and desires. There's no doubt. But in the context of Romans 13, I don't think that he would out and out say, abandon your heart's desire. I think he would ask me this question: do you love people as much as you are loving getting that new car? Now, hang on. I'm not buying everybody a new car, just so you know that. But perhaps maybe he'd ask me, does George Wright invest as much energy and desire and time to bless others as he invests his energy in blessing himself? That is what Paul's talking about here. Paul doesn't say stop your desires for happiness, start acting on some other principle of willpower or duty. He says take that deep, unstoppable, primal, powerful desire to be happy that we call loving ourselves and make it the measure and the means of how we love others. In other words, make the degree of your self-seeking the measure of your self-giving. Oh, what a radical idea that is, huh? Because that means if you're energetic in pursuing your own happiness, be energetic in pursuing the happiness of others. If you're creative in pursuing your own happiness, be creative in pursuing the happiness of your neighbor. If you're persevering in pursuing your own happiness, persevere in pursuing the happiness of others. Sometimes we find ourselves believing that a token gift to the local homeless shelter or this or that might be a token of our love for others when it's doing nothing more than giving us the chance to do this so that we can say that, well, I showed my love, I did that. What if we made the degree of our own self-seeking the measure of our self-giving? What if we measured our pursuit of happiness against the way we pursue the happiness of others? And so, how do we pursue our own well-being? We should pursue our neighbor's well-being the same way. Are you hungry? Well, feed a hungry neighbor. Are you thirsty? Give a thirsty neighbor something to drink. Are you lonely? Befriend someone who is lonely. Are you frightened? Find someone to comfort. Do you want to make a good grade on your exam? Help others do the same. You see, the implications of this are far-reaching, and this is a far more radical kind of love than the world knows. Because love stops being a competition to see how much I can benefit me, but it's like how much joy can I bring to others? We see this kind of love in our church and in people's lives, and I had thought at some point to single out people who I've seen as been exceptional people of service and character, but the thing that I will say is that this makes love way more than a duty. And you can see it when somebody serves, not because of obligation, but because they just love people. We see that. And so Paul says we have a debt. And that debt is to love others. It's a debt that comes from God's love poured out in us, and we can pursue loving others with reckless abandon. We can love others as much as we pursue our own happiness. And the beautiful thing, the amazing thing is that when the happiness of others becomes the goal of our desires, then they actually gain the sense of joy that God intended for us from the very beginning. So even though I'm bad at making resolutions, here's something I believe I can work on, because Jesus said this is a new commandment. As he spoke to his disciples that final time, he said, I can love more, I can love bigger, I can channel the energy that I have into loving myself and into loving others in the same kind of way. I think we're going to need that standard if we're going to talk about how we deal with government. If we're going to really talk about how to deal with the really hard things of the culture around us, I think we need to have this standard first. I mean, don't you just wish that when you watch the news that all the hatred would just go away and that real honest conversations could take place, right? We're going to need that, Christians. And Christians need to stop adding to the hatred. We need to stop doing that. We're going to need this when we meet a person in poverty. I'll never forget Judy talking with Laura. By the way, our young people are going to Wilmington this summer on a mission trip to work with Vigilant Hope. They work with people who are in need, and Judy's daughter Laura is very involved with that. She particularly works with the volunteers. But I'll never forget something that she told me one time. She goes, what is the thing that we all do when we see a person in need? We tend to do, not all, we tend to do this when we see a person in need. They're at a street corner, got a sign, they're on the sidewalk as you walk by. What do we tend to do? We tend to look away. She goes, sometimes the most important thing you can give a person that you can't maybe meet their immediate need, but you can give them the respect of giving them eye contact. You can look them in the eyes, and if you have the opportunity to do beyond that, that's always good. But she said, just look at people. I'll never forget that. It's changed me, how I even drive by people who are standing on a street corner in Boone, North Carolina with their sign. And I know I can't do something in that moment, but I can look at them and let them know I made contact for a moment. We can channel the energy that I have loving me into loving others. I can do that when my temptation is to turn all of my desires inward towards me. And so I'm going to need this obligation that I have to show the love of Christ to others. Because if I am freely loved and grace was freely given, then Paul understood what that meant for him. That's why he said, I am a debtor. And it is why he said, I am not ashamed. I'm under an obligation to the Jews, to the Greeks, to the church community and the world around us, because people need the Lord. They need salvation. They need Jesus, and they need to know how much God loves them. So if you're going to make a resolution for 2020, that's a good one, isn't it? To love bigger, to love more, it's a debt you cannot ever pay off. Let me ask you to bow your heads and close your eyes this morning. Lord, we need this constant, everyday reminder of who we are. We need this constant, everyday reminder of whose presence we sit in and stand in and work in and communicate in. When we're at our quiet moments all alone, or when we're in the midst of a boisterous crowd, Lord, you are there. And you have loved us. And so you know all the energy that we pour into loving ourselves. You know how desperately we want to make ourselves happy. What if this year we put that same kind of energy into loving others? We know the energy you put into loving us. You gave your life for us, Jesus. And so we are grateful people. Help us to do something about it. And I pray this in Jesus' name.